You ended up the last vidcast with this whole issue of getting into university, which becomes the crux of everything. Unlike their Chinese counterparts, getting into university is much sort of a generic thing in Japan. You apply to get into particular programs, but I think I could be wrong, but I think you get admitted to the university, period. And then depending on your scores, you might get into a preferable program. Um, and in the Chinese system, you actually apply to different programs. So, so that's where I stopped. Now there's something uniquely Japanese that occurs here. This is where it's totally different than the Chinese. In the Chinese system, once you get into university, continue to bust ass. You're still being hyper competitive. You're still seeing education as direct track to career success. So nothing's really changed. Chinese, if you think of it, sort of go through a lot longer period of struggle to get ahead that goes right through, I'd say, into their 30s. But certainly undergraduate university life in China is just as hyperactive, if not more so than it was, trying to get to the university in the first place. So Chinese students are really focused and really directed. And I know what the Chinese students I've had to deal, the few Chinese students I've had to deal with at Northwest University, those folks are, they've got a laser focus, very different than their American counterparts in undergraduate programs. Japanese students, on the other hand, I've never worked with a Japanese university, so my experience with Japanese students is very, very limited, but they're not going to be very impressive. The Japanese mentality is getting into university is the goal. Once you've gotten into university, unless you have some peculiar reason to, get involved in research, say AI or something like that, most folks just sort of collapse. It's like they've reached the finish line. So getting into university is the finish line. It's very hard even today in Japanese universities to get thrown out of university. You can't get just showing up is going to get you, basically passing grades, C's and probably B's. And because Japanese students just go through university, there's really no motivation to work really hard and, become a straight A student or, anything like that, because there's no advantage. The corporations or people or government that are going to hire you don't care. The university doesn't care. Even your parents probably don't care. So university is basically party time. It's like some of the classic stereotype of some of the American universities, where it's basically once you get in, it's like 3 or 4 years, party central. You don't have sororities and fraternities like you do in American universities, but nonetheless, there's this sort of goof around time. You see this sort of classically because if you watch Japanese game shows, I'm not sure where you pick those up nowadays. But what you realize is a lot of the folks that are actually competitors on the game shows are university students, which would be sort of unthinkable in the United States unless it was, somehow directed for that audience. Because those students are, folks like or students are they're supposed to be studying to get, good grades and to get into grad school or, get a career, or whatever. In Japan, you don't have to worry about that. Basically, as long as you continue to consume oxygen and don't get arrested for something, you're gonna graduate from university, and no one really cares what your degree is. So there's no point in spending a lot of time on it. So for undergraduates, they sort of like they check out. The only motivation that folks have, weirdly enough, is to get noticed by particular professors. Japanese universities from actually even pre-World War II. I'm not sure how far back it would go. I would guess probably 20s and 30s. But Japanese universities are sort of, like their American counterparts, be more sort of notoriously underfunded. And so what happened is, unlike their American counterparts, is that Japanese ministries, like the Ministry of Transportation, the Ministry of, Social Affairs, I can't remember what it's called, so whatever it is, certainly the Foreign Ministry, and also large Japanese corporations, Matsushita, Mitsubishi, Fuji, or Fujitsu more accurately. These large Japanese corporations and the ministries actually pay the salaries of a pretty significant proportion of Japanese professors. So if you're a professor at, say, Nagoya University, and I'm in the department of, say their equivalent of behavioral sciences. It's a good bet that maybe a third to a half of the folks in my department, in other words, my colleagues, are actually being paid probably by the foreign ministry, the social services ministry, maybe one or two Japanese companies, though I'm not sure why they would. But what that means is basically half of the salaries in the department or in that division aren't on the books as having to come from money given to the university or from tuition or any of the things that funds, for example, Shaman. So chaired positions, which are rare. I mean, you have some of them. I don't think we don't think I think we have one. Maybe the Hogan's program has one, but UH-Minot, which is typical American university, has a few. Generally, each department might have one at maximum one, but a lot of departments, in fact, whole large programs don't have any chaired positions. And that's typical of most American universities. The professors, the folks that teach at that university and do research at that university, either get grant money and or they're paid by wherever the university gets revenues from. In the case of UH-Minot, it's from the state, federal funds, and then also tuition. Uh, so I suppose you'd say there's a fair amount of independence or maybe autonomy in that. In the Japanese system, what that means is if we're part of a division, like say the behavioral sciences, half of the folks that work in that division, their check actually comes from someone else outside of the university. What it means is Japanese universities tend to be very, for a really blunt term, I'd argue fossilized, because while we'll say sociology wants to do something, the folks in the sociology department that are being funded by the foreign ministry, which would be a logical choice, are going to, they contact their bosses, their oyabun's, for example, in the foreign ministry and say, hey, these folks are talking about this, and they're going to get their voting orders from the ministry, not from the university, and not from their own, academic discipline. Now, in a rather strange extension of this, which you also find is a fair number of Japanese professors actually don't have particularly good advanced degrees. They're actually seconded from the ministry. Now, if you're doing, say, international business, I could see where maybe having one or two folks in the international business department that are, international business specialists from the foreign ministry, which would be logical in some ways, might be okay. But between the folks that are funded by the foreign ministry and the fact that these folks that are teaching at the university from the foreign ministry might only have a bachelor's degree, it means that you end up in this weird situation that the professors really aren't there. I would argue that many Japanese professors really aren't there to teach in the classic way. They're actually there as connections, and so I'll take courses from Professor Fujimori in the foreign ministry, in the international business program, because I know he's from the foreign ministry. He was sent over by the foreign ministry, 3 years ago. He's going to be teaching for maybe another 4 years at Nagoya University. So I'm going to make sure I take courses from him, because what's going to happen is when I graduate, I want to contact him and see if he can give me access or become my oyabun, if you want to think of it this way, with the foreign ministry. So you PR and basically kiss up to members of the faculty because of their connections with either large Japanese corporations or with the various ministries. So you don't care what he teaches. You don't care even what program he teaches in. What you want is his access and his support, i.e. to be an oyabun and you be his koban with the foreign ministry. So he really is, in some ways, he really isn't at the university. It's almost like, it's like a temporary, well, it is a temporary assignment. Yeah, I don't know. I can't really think of how to describe it. But this is a large proportion of the faculty at Japanese universities are folks whose allegiance, alignment, philosophy, and everything are different directions. And notice we're not talking a different direction, we're talking about different directions. So it makes universities very strange animals in Japan, which is one reason why foreign universities, whether they be American, European universities, or whether they be Chinese universities, which are the ones I'm most familiar with, really have a hard time working with their Japanese counterparts because you're not sure. There's a small group of professors at a Japanese university who are sort of classical professors, but a lot of the other folks are sort of temporary there for 3 to 5 years, or in many cases are actually folks that have been retired. So if Fujimori had been with the foreign ministry, for example, he's now in his mid-50s, and he hasn't been a particularly outstanding guy. And his particular network, Voyab and Kobin, lost whatever the last game was they played in the foreign ministry. So he's sort of on the outs with the system. And then what they'll do is they'll put him at the university as a way to sort of get him out of the game playing at the foreign ministry. Now, that also means it's sort of problematic because students that tie their success at the university to him are going to find themselves sort of compromised because he's part of a losing faction at the ministry. So, yeah, I mean, it's just, it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, it's typically Japanese. Networks are everything. But the problem is universities, the networks, most departments at Japanese universities, the networks don't have much of anything to do with the academic background of that particular discipline or that department. This just to reemphasize stuff I mentioned before. Japanese schools, especially elementary, but also right through middle school, their main goal is socialization. Their job is to make their students into good, normal Japanese. So those kids that we've seen, umpteen times, the Takayama kids, that's why they're on that field trip. That's why they'll do stuff together. The teacher, that's a major part of his job. He's going to be rated on his success or failure as a teacher, and how good his students socialize, how normal, if you would, how much they fit the normative values of Japanese society. In this, notice how well they do in educationally is actually second, because that to a large part is expected to be a problem for the parents, specifically the mother, and also for the jukus or after the cram schools. And that's not necessarily central to his job as a primary school teacher at a Japanese public school or even Japanese private school for that matter. The other thing, and this is something that teachers actually do a lot to make happen, and that's why you do a lot of field trips, is this idea of developing personal networks with classmates. I know one of our friends I think it's every 4 years, she and the remaining members of her third grade class get together and they always go to hot springs, usually in the north part of Japan. They leave their spouses behind. This is just for the members of that group. This is a third grade class. I don't know about you, but I don't even, at gunpoint, I don't think I can remember anyone from my third grade class, including the teacher. And we certainly never had any contact after that. But in Japan, this is normal. This is expected. Third grade, sixth grade, not so much middle school, but certainly high school, in terms of, especially in neighborhood, folks going together to high school together. But you have to remember what that means is the folks in high school in many ways are going to be still your third grade and sixth grade classmates because you're going to generally go together. The only place you split up with will be at university. But by then you've already had 10 years of social networking. So this is incredibly strong. Probably in some ways, at least when you talk to individuals, they would say that their classmate social relationships, because they're so useful, because they cross, socioeconomic lines, but also because they've had so many years to be in place, is they're as powerful in some ways as marriage relationships. And in some ways, as if not more powerful than kin relationships. A very uniquely Japanese thing. Again, this explicit link between the university and the workplace. What university you go to defines what jobs are going to be open to you. You might have a little bit of this in the United States. If you're going to go to Harvard Law School versus, don't take it wrong to say UH Law School. I would think that's going to open different links up at the federal level, and say the American government. But for many workplaces, I don't think they really care. They're going to want to know what your skill competency levels are. In Japan, they don't care. Part of this is we'll get into a little more later, is that in the Japanese system, the attitude is what they really want to know is how hard do you work. So this gambate thing is what they're actually measuring. They're not measuring the amount of knowledge you've acquired from the time you were in kindergarten through university. What they want to know is you're willing to bust ass. And so the university becomes the place where that's sort of evaluated. And the professors, especially the ones from the Zaibatsu, from the large companies, but also a lot of the ministries, especially the foreign ministries, famous for this. They basically act as recruiters. On one hand, they're teaching classes, but what little I've seen of class notes in one class, it was pitiful. You could have done, well, now you could do a lot better with AI. But even 20 years ago, you could have done, undergraduates could have written the class notes better than the professor did. And that was because, the professor's job, as far as he saw it, was basically he was there as a recruiter for, I think it was Sony. So, he really didn't care what people learned in the class because one, it wasn't relevant. And two, that wasn't his marching orders. He was actually a retired, 60 something year old guy from Sony. And he was there to be Sony's recruiter on that campus. He just happened to be teaching classes, but still paid by Sony. So, this idea that university education has absolutely no relevant job training. To a certain extent in the United States, it's certainly true now with AI just disturbing everything, is there's a lot of concern from, undergraduates especially, that the job training they're getting won't be, quote, that relevant, unquote. I use that in quotes because relevance is always a silly measure of anything. If you learn to think and you learn how to express yourself, if you think of, in my regular classes, the critical thinking papers, learning to make a good argument, learning to do your research, learning to do your background. Then one of the things you very quickly is you can, among other things, it's very easy to recognize AI papers because usually the actual background analysis is actually crappy. The bibliographic references are ridiculous. You can usually tell them right off the bat. So, AI makes for an easy paper, but also makes for a real shitty paper in most cases. The Japanese system, there's never been any assumption that anything you learn at university has any relevance. Now, mind you, there are exceptions. If you're going to go to something really different, like say robotics, which Osaka University is famous for, or archaeology, which Tokyo University is famous for, and Kyoto University is famous for that too, and certain aspects of the arts, which Kyoto is famous for. That in that situation, you go into those programs because you want to learn that stuff and you're going to do it at the university. But I would argue that 80 to 90% of the students in those universities, one, they're not in those programs, and two, they don't see any relevance to, going to Kyoto gives them access to better jobs. They're not going to learn anything at Kyoto University that's going to be useful to that job or their future career. It's the networking that's going to be key. So it's just a real different view of things. And again, folks, especially even more so than Americans, Chinese universities just do not understand this. It makes no sense to them. It's ridiculous as far as they're concerned. Okay, Japanese business. Some of this had actually faded out. The first one of these had actually faded out some in the 1990s. By the 2000s, it wasn't noticeable. I would argue by 2015, 2018, especially before COVID, what happened is this suddenly popped back up, and now it's this huge way that Japanese have sort of not found themselves. I'm not sure what you want to call it, identified themselves. Again, if you remember, I mentioned a couple of presentations ago about geosociobiology, the idea that Japanese see themselves as being unique. In the period from the Meiji rise, the 1870s through 1945, the Japanese developed this really strong sense of Nihonjin, the fact that the Japanese are unique. Now, what this also got spun off on is a very strong siege, paranoia, for lack of a better term, not even mentality, just siege paranoia. Everyone hated Japanese. Everyone didn't like anything to do with the Japanese. So therefore, you can't trust anyone who isn't Japanese. And the only people that have your best interest are, at heart, they're Japanese. So there was this like uber nationalism, but it had a strong streak of paranoia, and it was really tied to geosociobiology. So, Japanese in Hawaii or Japanese in Brazil or whatever were just as untrustworthy as folks who, had no Japanese heritage. Japanese businesses and the Japanese corporate ethos was grounded in this. It kept this after World War II, even with the collapse of all the other stuff at the end of World War II, the collapse of the samurai and all this type of stuff. The businesses kept their attitude, and and I don't know, maybe in part because they didn't go through there was no Japanese equivalent to the Marshall Plan. After World War II, everyone just sort of said, fine, we've wiped you guys off the planet pretty much. Just sort of fend for yourselves. That actually reinforced this. So when Japan becomes successful in the 60s and 70s, it's with a new, sort of a reinterpreted chip on their shoulder about the fact that the only folks that you can trust are the Japanese, because absolutely no one's ever had any positive things to say about Japanese. Now, this isn't true, but that's been the Japanese spin on it. And it's sad to say there's been enough truth in that to, warrant some of it. So what happens is the business ethos in Japan, this is still true today, is that Japanese can only trust Japanese. That if even Japanese or multinational conglomerates like Mitsubishi or something like that, senior management or anyone who's a decision maker has to be Japanese. And if there is someone in position of authority who isn't Japanese, you really don't listen to them. Well, this has been a huge problem for Chrysler Daimler, which is also is Nissan. I forget which one it is. Anyways, because the Japanese corporate ethos of that Japanese car manufacturer doesn't matter if Daimler, Mercedes, or Chrysler is in charge, they're still going to do their own thing because you might have the guy from Chrysler might be the head of the multinational corporation, but the Japanese branch of that company is getting firmly convinced that the only folks that really know what's going on, that have their shit together, and you can trust are the Japanese. Now, of course, the complication of it's not actually Japanese. It's going to be the subset of Japanese that are part of your faction. So notice how this just turns into a zoo really quick. What happens is post World War II, as I mentioned before, the salaryman, the guy who has a 9 to 6 job in Japan, who dresses in the black suit, he becomes the stereotype of the new Japanese. He takes on, in fact, they sort of spin out the idea that he even has like a new behavioral code of Bushido. So he becomes like a non-sword wielding version of a samurai. And especially in the 70s and 80s, they really believed this. It was really trippy dealing with some of these guys. They weren't really arrogant per se, but that's because, I'm not Japanese. But they really had a strong sense that they were going to be the success of Japan, and it was going to be the hard work that was going to make Japan successful, and you couldn't trust anyone else. In that, what then becomes is the head of the company, especially larger companies, the CEO especially, becomes the new daimyo, the new lord and master. So what happens is the company sort of spins itself as the new clan. The folks that are working, on 9 to 6 jobs in there, in the offices, the office workers become the new samurai, the salarymen, and the head of the company becomes the new clan lord, the new daimyo. And those guys, those guys acted like it. I only interacted with old man Seibu for Seibu, Seibu conglomerate. But he, when he came to Maui, he was a daimyo. He wasn't dressed like one, but the way everyone treated him, his expectations, everything like that, his decisions he'd make, the way he'd interact with folks. You could kick him back 200 years earlier, put him in Edo, and he would fit right into some version of the 47 Ronin. It was sort of amazing. So what happened is Japan post World War II found itself one of the world's largest economic powers. But the way they got there and the way they behaved was actually not terribly different than Japan in the 1600s, for example, in many ways. And what this meant, if you were this is still true today, if you're someone who's not Japanese, that includes folks, from Hawaii who have Japanese heritage. In other words, if you're not part of the Nihonjin package, then you're never going to get ahead of a Japanese company. You're never going to be anybody. And this includes Japanese that, for example, have been sent outside of Japan to train. A friend of ours, for example, was sent outside 3 years to train in Europe for a company. He didn't have any choice, and he wasn't allowed to come back. And there obviously had been some sort of political gamesmanship with the faction he was a part of. That was part of the punishment, was to do that. So ever since then, his rank has been lower than his, co-year, the folks that joined in the same year who are part of other factions. Even though he's oftentimes tapped to be a senior advisor in projects because he's smart, he's very good at what he does. He's never going to be, anybody in the corporation's, senior management because one, he's part of the wrong faction, but even more important, he was outside of Japan for 3 years. So one, he loses on seniority. Second, he loses on geosociobiology. And I'm pretty sure he's not okay with it, but he's Japanese. He realizes that's the hand he got dealt with. It is what it is. So performance is not anything to do with anything. It's entirely based on seniority plus your social network. And this creates a lot of problems for Japanese companies when they suddenly have to switch. That's why Japanese companies have been doing so poorly. First, they moved into and bought up Korean and Chinese companies, and then they moved moved their production over there. And then they started to move into, especially China, as new markets. And they've just been getting their clock handed, they're handed to them by the Chinese companies because Japanese companies really have very poor abilities to turn stuff around. They're not fast on their feet. They don't make changes quickly because the folks in charge are in charge because they just lasted longer than anyone else. They made the right choices in terms of social networking. Their ability to make decisions tied to business or government are really not measured in terms of why they're in a position. Notice how in this then you also have this paradox. On one hand, in Japanese companies, in fact, even more so in government ministries, the year that you join the ministry or the year that you join the company, actually, of course, that defines your seniority, right? It's the number of years you've been with, Sony, for example. On the other hand, as you move up obviously move up the corporate ladder, the number of positions shrinks. You only need one manager for 60 underlead, workers. So as you move up the system, what happens is the number of options available starts to disappear. So seniority really doesn't work very well when you think about it, whether it be ministry or whether it be in business, because unless people are keeling over all the time, you're very going to quickly end up at a bottleneck where you have more people that are, quote, qualified for the job because they've been there for 10 years. Then you've got positions open. And that's where the Oib and Koban, the social network, comes in. So what you find is it's very typical in Japanese companies. And from what I understand, Japanese ministries, though, to be honest, I've never really dealt with Japanese ministries much, at least the gossip I've heard, is that what you then find is torpedoing someone else's career is extremely normal business practice. And I know at least from our very limited experience with Japanese companies, this is sort of like normal business. So bad mouthing people indirectly, setting them and their whole Oib and Koban part of the network up for failure is considered normal business practice. Now, notice the key here is, of course, we're talking to folks in the same company. So if this is Sony, then you're actually setting up another chunk of your same branch, let's say electronics or something like that, or computers for Sony. You're setting up another branch of your own company for failure, which means that it's going to cost the company money. So Sony as a corporation is going to take it on the chin because the different factions are all busy infighting and sabotaging each other. And this is just considered normal practice. Some companies are worse. Sony has always been famous for this, and as far as I know, they still are, which is one reason why a lot of their dominance, whether it be TVs, computers, etc., is just completely faded because they've been having so much fun, sort of wiping out their own factions in Sony, as they tend to forget that their business market is not Sony. Their business market is the world. Typical. Managerial paternalism. Japanese senior management sees themselves as the new daimyo. They see themselves as the new lord and master. Therefore, they're very much sort of like uncles or parents to the folks that work under them. I mean, you hear this a lot, and you see it a lot in almost every Japanese company, and it's expected. So if somehow you were, non-Japanese, you ended up in a position of authority, you'd be expected to behave that way with the folks underneath you. Now, this involves everything from finding your salarymen who work for you spouses, to dealing with their issues because their kids in the second grade not doing very well. So in many ways, you really do take on, you take on the old samurai role of the head of the household or the head of the, faction in that town or something like that. And the folks that work for you, they're not really your children per se, but to a certain extent, your success is based on providing for them. And they will very frequently, especially if the Oib and Koban, thing is part of the system, you can see, it's not unusual, especially when they go out drinking, to see 40 or 50-year-old Japanese guys who are salarymen who suddenly break down and act like, 10-year-old kids with their Oibun to give them advice on all sorts of stuff, which, in many cases would actually horrify, anyone else. And HR would go nuts. My wife is not happy with me anymore. I underperform in the bed, all sorts of weird, very, very personal stuff that Americans or European companies, or even Chinese, would just go absolutely berserk with even bringing it up. But in a Japanese company, that's part of what you do if you're a senior. Um, and so the trade is the company gives you a job. And until 10 years ago, the company gave you a job till you retired at age 57. And what you did is you then paid them back in the classic Japanese fashion. You gave them loyalty, you gave them dedication, you gave them sacrifice. And this classically would be Japanese, and this is still true for most Japanese workers. They go to work at 9 in the morning. They work until usually 6 in the afternoon, evening. They then go out drinking or eating with their counterparts and basically continue working till midnight. And then they go home, and then they get up and go back to work. It's 7:30, 8 in the morning, and then do the same thing. And they do, and on Saturdays, they voluntarily put in maybe 6 to 10 hours of work, and they're not getting reimbursed for any of this. There's no such thing as overtime in Japan. I've never heard of it. I've never seen it, and I can't imagine it actually existing. Now, Chinese do something similar. I can never remember the slang term for this. There's a term in China for the hours. I'm going to say 9 to 9, 6, 9 from 9 to 9, 6 days a week. I think that's what it is. And they don't get paid either. The difference is in China, you're going to get your ass fired if you don't do it. Because again, Chinese business is incredibly competitive. So you literally have to do that or else you're out on the street. In the Japanese system, you're just going to find that, you're going to disappoint everyone. Your Oiban's going to be all bummed because now you're making his faction look bad. Now, there's going to be a huge amount of emotional pressure to keep up the game. But notice here what's missing is any sense of performance. Huge difference between Chinese and Japanese. In Chinese system, a lot is based on what you do, how well you perform. In the Japanese system, it's the hours you put in. So this is like gambate again. This is why you recruit university students based on their gambate, because that's what they're going to do in the job that you give them. They're going to work. They're going to work hard. I use that in quotes for the company. In the Japanese corporation, this is sort of fading in the last decade, but till say 2010, work was more important than family ties. So your marriage might fall apart. Your relationship with your kids will be non-existent. All your social relationships will be secondary to working for Sony or Matsushita or whoever it is. And that's the dedication. And this is why, of course, that from the corporate standpoint, very cynically, they spin themselves off as the new daimyo and the new clan. And this is one reason why all Japanese companies from middle level up have those company pins that you always have to wear. If you think about it, the only other folks that wear pins are those, elites that we see, the folks tied to the various crested families. And that's, of course, the old samurai families. They have the pins to show their, relationship back to their past of being samurai. Modern Japanese salarymen show the relationship to what I would call the new samurai, which is the company they work for. A bunch of this I've already gone over. The loyalty infighting is normal in Japanese companies. If you watch, any sort of you keep up with the Japanese companies, especially if they're competitive, like say in the airlines, Japan Airlines versus ANA, et cetera, you can tell when they get into a massive amount of infighting because all of a sudden their market share starts to collapse and they seem to lose direction. And that's because they have, to a certain extent, they've lost track of, competing with, say, ANA because, factions within Japan Airlines, for example, maybe have decided, for some reason, they're going after other factions. So there's infighting within their corporation, which means they're losing track of what they're supposed to be doing outside the corporation. I don't think JAL's going through that at all now. But I mean, all Japanese companies do this. It's part of the way they do stuff. And that's this whole loyalty thing. One of the ways you sort of classically see this, and this is again this whole idea of the corporation as the new clan, is when you look at Japanese documents, and they still they do this electronically, so it'd be PDFs now. But you're usually going to see a print version of this. And what you're going to see is like a cover sheet to a PDF. So we'll say that the company, a branch of the company, we'll say it's Nissan, and they've come up with a new, their new version of a hybrid sports car. So that's being developed by, one branch of Nissan Motors. So what they're going to do is they, come up with a, sort of like a plan. Okay, this is what it's going to look like. This is what it's going to cost, et cetera. What you're going to see is with that development plan, is there's a front document. There's like a cover sheet for like, yeah, it's a cover sheet for lack of a better term. And what that's actually, that's going to be printed out. There'll be an electronic version, but also a print version. And everyone who reads the document, this car document, once they've done reading it, they have to stamp that cover sheet. Now, in Japan, that's still true today. You don't sign things. You get a license stamp. I don't have one because I never did enough work with Japanese to actually need it. Our company had one. But if I was to spend more time working with Japanese, you actually get this stamp. There's actually, you go to specific shops that actually do these stamps. And these stamps are licensed by the government. So it's like getting a driver's license. You go in, you decide on what the stamp should look like, or well, they tell you what the stamp should look like. And then they design it, and it's a stamp. It's a the usual ones are made of wood or metal, but I've seen some where they're made of jade. And then at the bottom, you've actually got a stamp, and you stamp it in red. So you stamp stuff like this, which I don't know anyone in the United States uses for stamps for anything anymore. But that's this ringi system, it's called. Now, what this means is because in the Japanese system, and unlike the Chinese system or the American system, you start the development of something like the sports car that Nissan's working on. That's going to start at the bottom of the company. So there's going to be a work group or task group set up to actually develop this. They're going to send that around to the other folks in the bottom of the company. So what happens in the Japanese system is a new plan, a new whatever comes from the bottom up. And so everyone in the bottom, as they read this thing, are going to put their stamp on it. As it moves up the corporation, up the corporate ladder, it's going to acquire all these stamps. Now, any individual anywhere in the system not stamping the document stops it. So it's like a veto. So if all of a sudden some middle manager who has nothing to do with sports cars decides that he just he can't support this, he just won't stamp it. And at that point, the whole thing comes to a screeching halt. Now, if he persists in that, then they have to go back and redesign the whole thing. What will usually happen is they will contact him, contact his Oibun, and other members of his, network, and basically say, you're screwing everything up for the entire corporation, so get your shit together and sign this damn thing. And then he'll generally stamp it. But it's this whole idea of consensus that by the time something gets up to the CEO, everyone in the corporation who's a salaryman or better has voted for it, and you can see that vote because they've all got their individual stamps or their equivalent to an initial on it. They've approved it. This makes it very difficult for senior management to say no to something, which can lead to some really strange situations. The other things you see, this is less common now than it used to be, but Japanese companies, a few Japanese companies I still do anything with, still have this. You'll find that Japanese company, I think it's a really good idea. They have what I call a general department. There's different slang terms for this, but it's like unspecified stuff. And somobu is actually sort of the slang term for this. I'm sure there's actually a technical term, but I can't remember what it is. Anything that the Japanese company has to deal with that they don't normally have, it doesn't fit well into one of their divisions or units, they give to these guys. So in a weird way, what happens is these guys are in charge of all sorts of eclectic stuff, but they also end up being really powerful because one of the things they've been getting charged with in almost all Japanese companies is running the ringi through. So even though they didn't, even though they would not be part of the work group that develops the sports car, for Nissan, once the plan develops and the signature sheet gets, the cover sheet gets set up, members of the somobu will be the ones that actually then run that around and make sure that everyone's seen it and make sure that everyone signs it. So these guys most Japanese companies tend to be sort of scared of these guys. They're like you think of like police dramas and what is it, internal affairs. Somobu ends up being sort of like the corporate version of internal affairs. I would suspect it'd be more terrifying at the ministries. It'd be fascinating to meet some of the guys in the foreign ministry who are part of their general department. I bet you those puppies kick ass. I bet you everyone's terrified to see them show up because you don't know what they're doing. You don't know what they're in charge of. You don't know what their marching orders are, this week, this month, this year. The Somobu guys almost always, at least in what I've heard, would be one or two social networks. So these guys are real power brokers. Just as a warning, if you ever have to deal with Japanese companies or Japanese ministries, keep your antenna tuned for when one of these guys shows up. And you can usually tell because if they show up, one will be introduced. their business card will have something like general department or, multiple duties or something like that. But also just watching the way that even seniors, people who are actually technically superior to them and the rest of the company, act when they show up will make it very, very clear that, the big tigers entered the room. Um, yeah. So one of the things that's interesting, by the 1990s, Japanese moved from being Japanese corporations, Zaibatsu is the slang for the Japanese megacorps, into multinationals. Um, and this worked fine for about, 10, 15 years. They were very successful, had a good grasp of what was going on. And they would just sort of swallow up American or European companies pretty easily because they were better at doing stuff. And that stayed the same as long as they had this grasp of the world around them. What happened is by the mid late 1990s is this started to fall apart as the world turned out to be much more complex, as Japanese, business especially ended up having to deal more with, say, Chinese or Vietnamese or whatever, business competition, especially at the low and middle end of stuff. That tended to then shrink a lot of this. Companies like Nissan, which had been, big players in the, 80s and 90s, even early 2000s, find themselves dealing with Japanese, and then of course Korean companies, Hyundai and Kia, and now BYD, and the Chinese companies. They suddenly find themselves competing on a world market that they didn't plan for, and they're really, given their very poor ability to move quickly, really aren't in a position to deal with effectively. So what happens is all of a sudden by the mid late 1990s, but certainly by the 2000s, is the big what had become multinationals find themselves laying folks off. Now, initially, of course, you're going to lay off the non-Japanese. So you cut all your staff and stuff at, like famously, Toyota went and cut their almost all their design staff in LA, which was actually the folks that designed a lot of their cars in the 90s, 2000s, which made sense for a national market, an American-based design group, even though they had a lot of Japanese designers there. Probably made more sense for just, understanding the aesthetic, direction that folks wanted to buy a car from. But since they weren't Japanese, that means that Toyota's going to lay them off first before it's going to lay off folks that are part of the system, the whole, seniority, loyalty based system. By the early 2000s, they'd run out of folks to lay off. And so they'd started laying off, they had to start laying off Japanese workers. This became a huge problem in the first economic collapse, 07, 08, 09. Well, actually, an earlier one in Japan, then the second economic collapse in Japan was, I think, 11 and 12, 13, something like that, when Japanese corporations really had to shrink down. And they started to lay off a bunch of these salarymen. And, in China or other countries, if you're laid off, then you have to just find another job. It's just fine. It is what it is. They don't like it, but there wasn't a strong sense of loyalty in the first place. In the Japanese system, you suddenly find someone who's 42 years old and they work. I'm going to pick on Nissan, why not? They were most famous for huge layoffs. So I've been working for Nissan since I graduated from university. At university, I went to Nagoya University. I think the Nissan plant's near there, and tied myself to one of their professors/recruiters. So I've been a loyal Nissan worker since I graduated from university. I'm now in my early 40s. The faction I'm a part of hasn't been successful terribly, but I've never done anything wrong. My faction's never done anything stupid. Well, wrong. They might have done stupid, but so there's nothing to make me vulnerable. And then all of a sudden one day, Nissan says, well, we're going to whack everyone in this particular department who aren't part of the right social network, because we've got to cut costs. So all of a sudden I find myself out on the street. Now, there's two problems. One is I have no skill set because my skill set was entirely trained in me by Nissan. Nissan brought me in. They spent probably a year or two, a year and a half when I first joined Nissan, training me in how Nissan does stuff. Every job I moved into in Nissan then would have its own training for me to do that job. So everything I know is the Nissan way of doing stuff. They've been drumming into me before I even started that I'm a Nissan worker. I'm loyal to the Nissan clan, if you want to think of it that way. My entire, Oibin social network is Nissan co-workers. And now all of a sudden that's gone. I'm now basically a Ronin, if I want to go back to the classic sense. I now have no one. My entire adult life of loyalty has now just been, thrown on the sidewalk. And what you found, you see less of them now, but it's sort of sad you still see some. But especially in the 2010 to 2015 period, if you went to any park, say Osaka or I'm sure Nagoya, though I never been to parks in Nagoya. What you'd find a bunch of folks, relatively speaking, dressed in salaryman outfits who are sitting, looking on their phones or playing with a laptop or just, reading manga or something like that. Um, in a park at like 10, 11, 12, 2 to 4 in the afternoon, in a work day. And you're thinking like, well, what the hell? They're not sick. They're outside. Well, they're not working anymore because they don't have a job anymore. Um, in Asia, as in most of the world, well, except for maybe Europe and the United States, but certainly in Asia, when you leave a company, especially if the company cuts staff, you get nothing. Um, you get a you get a very small pension, which is usually about the equivalent to, I think it's 6 months of your salary. But if you figure if I'm 42 years old, that's 6 months of a salary. We'll say that's in American maybe $15,000 since Japanese don't get paid squat. That $15,000 is going to have to carry me till I'm 90 years old, and that's it. Social Security in Japan is a laugh. It's basically nothing. Now, mind you, they have universal health, but it's not that good. That doesn't qualify things like food to eat. So I'm basically helpless. Um, I can get a job at ramen stand or something like that. And that's where you generally find these folks. Especially you don't even find it convenies because like 7-Eleven or Circle K or the other convenies. I don't know in America what you call them, convenience stores. They're part of corporations too, and they recruit people. So you might find yourself at a convenience, but you'll only be working at cash register. You'll never be anybody. So the rest of your entire self identity, your entire professional career, everything just vanished. Poof. And because you don't have any job skills, no other Japanese car company is going to hire you because what you've learned how to do is only useful for Nissan. It's the Nissan way. And if I'm, Fujitsu or Mitsubishi or something like that, I have no interest in Nissan way of doing things. There's the Mitsubishi way of doing stuff. So there's this absolute disaster. In fact, this just showed up this year. I remember just seeing Honda was actually planning on buying Nissan, and something fell through. I'm not sure why. I suspect it was negotiating social networks between the two companies. But Nissan's basically on the ropes. They're basically bankrupt right now. So what, all those folks are suddenly going to find themselves in the same nightmare that other of their coworkers found 10, 15 years ago when they suddenly found themselves on the street. So this is the downside of the Japanese system. It's very sturdy and very stable as long as the times remain good. When times go bad, this is an absolute. It's just like watching the Titanic go down. Um, and government is the same thing. Everyone in government service has been hired from the time they went through university. Every teacher has been hired by, if they're sponsored by somebody, they've been hired from the time they finish 2-year or 4-year school, university. Most elementary, especially kindergarten teachers, go through a 2-year, like a KCC, a community college program. But most everyone else goes through a 4-year program. It's usually specific for like elementary or middle or high school. And then, so, again, you're going to have the same system. If you're at a public school, you're part of there's a series of social networks, you're part of one. So if I'm, 42 years old and Nissan employee, I might have been working in the business department. So I think, well, I can go teach, business, for a high school or teach math classes for an elementary school. There's no way they would touch me with a 100-foot pole because I'm not part of their system. So what this has meant is that folks under the age of now, mid 40s have become really cynical about the promises of the Japanese company. And of course, the promises of the Japanese government, because these are integrated wholes, because it's the promise of the education system. If I'm 42 years old, I think back from the time I was 4 to 5 years old, I was busting ass to get into Nissan. From the time I was in Nissan, I was, at least doing gabate through Nissan with the idea that I would survive till I'm 57 and then I retire. And now all of a sudden, I'm nobody. Now, my entire identity was a company that's now rejected me. And what you'll find that's really sad is that when you actually watch these folks, I remember seeing a bunch of them around 2015, 2017, is they still would wear the company pin in their lapel. And to be honest, as someone who's not Japanese, I couldn't see the logic of that. There's no way that company's ever gotten, no Japanese company's ever hired back folks they laid off. Never. So once you're out, you're gone. They're rather cynically, they're going to bring in a new group of freshmen, folks that just, graduated from university and bring in a new group, this year's group, if you would, rather than hire back a bunch of 40 somethings that have worked for the company for 20 years. So yeah, it's the cynicism is totally not surprising. And it's a huge part of it's really pervading every aspect of Japanese society. Um, you see this a lot with Japanese social media, specifically Japanese manga. There was a huge outgrowth of manga in the 2010 through I'd say 2020 period of the Japanese worker that has been chucked out by the company. Very depressing manga to read, but actually very reflective, as manga usually are, very reflective of the realities of the Japanese work environment. Now, what this meant is a whole mess of stuff. So you've got a huge amount of underemployed, skilled, and what were motivated professionals. But if I'm 42 years old and Nissan's throwing me out, and you say that Circle K gives me a job as a cash register operator, I'm never going to be motivated for Circle K. My company, the company I was quote born into, if you want to think of it that way, was always Nissan. And from what I hear now, I've never actually seen this, so this is just rumor. I don't really know. Um, my Circle K, since the convenience stores, you wear a vest, you don't wear a three-piece suit. But even though I'll have the Circle K vest, and I'll usually have if I'm anyone who's like a manager of a store, I'll have the Circle K pin. What I very possibly would have, at least what I've heard, is underneath, facing the inside, so no one can see it, is I'll still have my Nissan pin. I've never been able to understand why Japanese are loyal to something that's just screwed them over. And this has become real typical in the Japanese corporate environment. But it also makes things real fragile because all the social networks and individuals that start working at Nissan, they see that because the system's still based on seniority, so the bad decision making that put Nissan in that situation in the first place hasn't gone away. It's just the workforce is shrinking. Then everyone's just sort of thinking, well, this is the Titanic's already, 40% under. When's the rest finish off? So this loyalty is really surreal. So it sort of summarizes this way. The Japanese economy is entirely service sector based. Most Japanese companies have under 5 employees. Most of them are either family or a group of folks that work for someone. So if you want to think of this would be a yakitori or a restaurant or a ramen stand or something like that with a couple of folks working there. And that's it. That's the huge majority, especially nowadays, even more so, is the huge majority of Japanese companies. And that's what they've got. That's all they've got. There's no larger structure. They're entirely, based on competitive, competing with 20 other groups doing the same thing. It's based in service. Japanese have always been really big on providing service, and they're still, I would argue, the best in the world at this. But now, of course, now it's hyper competitive because you've got a bunch of other companies with a bunch of other desperate little companies desperately trying to also compete, for the ever shrinking number of folks that actually have money in Japan. As the number of salarymen decrease, then the number of folks that are going to go to a yakitori stand is going to decrease. The number of folks that are going to get a bento is going to decrease. So it's a classic situation we saw in Hawaii when the service sector, when the number of people that can spend money shrinks, then the service sector takes it on the chin first. In fact, I want to show you some images here. This is most Japanese companies. This is on the riverside in Fukuoka. Is famous for stalls, and these guys. This is good. This is good food. But notice you've only got 6 chairs, maybe 7. You've got a little bit of takeout, or no, I think they had 10 spots. I ended up sitting there thinking, and this is the owner. And so this is the number 2. So it's a two. I think you said they had a third person that hadn't showed up. This was a weeknight, so I'm not sure what their busy days are, but they can. There's only room here for two people to work, obviously. So I think they rotate his staff. There's one other person they rotate days. But his entire ability to pay rent, to have a moped or whatever he needs in life is based on his ability to make this competitive and financially successful. And he's got absolutely nothing in his favor. A classic example is, let's take a look at another image here. This is the reality. There's like 25, maybe 30 stalls, and half of them are selling exactly the same thing. It's generally yakitori type sort of grilled stuff. Some of the places are ramen places. His was largely, I can't remember what his was now. Anyways, it was really good. But all these stalls are, one or two person operations. This guy out here is trying to bring in business, very typical. What I'll do, he'll stand out here. He's actually the other worker here. I think they had three here. But his job is to, sort of not really a cost, but advertise as people are walking by, hey, come in and try this out. We've got the best, da 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 da. This is real typical of Japanese, corporate, company operations. But again, these guys desperately need business. They've got maybe 10 or 12 spots. They make most of their money off the beer they sell. But every day literally is hand to mouth. There's no future here. If it rains really heavily, then all of a sudden business completely disappears. When it gets really cold in the winter, business largely disappears. So this is Fukuoka, so it doesn't get too super cold. But anything that messes with that, and what that also means is more and more Japanese, end up being like salarymen out of work or something like that. That means the number of Japanese like him, he looks like a classic salaryman. The number of folks like him that actually can afford to come and eat at a place like this is going to shrink. So he's desperately looking for business, and you never know from one day to the next, one week to the next, 1 year to the next, how well things are going to do. So these places are constantly folding up and starting. Very, very high risk environment, entirely based on service, because I can guarantee the food at almost all these places is probably superb. It has to be, because if it's not as good as your neighbors, then you're going to be out of business by next week. This is the Japanese, business world. Very small companies, very, very just minuscule margins, and literally surviving, day to day. It is how they do business, because that's the reality of the Japanese world. Let's see here. Now, even in the larger corporate systems, here where Nagoya is one of Nagoya's shopping streets, which are very typical of Japanese, situations. Now, this isn't the big department stores. Takashimaya and other big department stores have their own equivalent to, not really so much Walmart, but more like Macy's or something like, sort of like a higher end large store. Bloomingdale's would be a good example of the equivalent of Takashimaya's. But what you see here is this mall, which goes for, I think, about 7 blocks. Most of them are quite long. Every shop here is individually owned. Now, they might be part of a corporate system. So like this ABC shoes, I don't know, these for some reason it's hugely popular in Japan, ABC shoes. I've never figured out why. But each of these stores, I was talking to the guy that ran one, not the one here. And they're actually like licensee operations. So on one hand, ABC Shoes provides the shoes, but it's his job to negotiate the rent with the mall. It's his job to provide salaries. If he doesn't provide enough revenue stream back to ABC, in other words, if he doesn't sell enough shoes to make their money back to make these guys happy, then they cut him off and boom, he's out of luck. This place over here, I think, is probably individually owned. As you go down here, the vast majority of all these little shops, whether it be food shops, whether it be stationary shops, whatever they are entirely owned by a person or a couple of folks. So you've got this folk here who's obviously the shop assistant. Now, what he's going to also do is if he sees, like these girls slow down and check this stuff out, he's going to encourage them to come in. I don't see any other shop assistants in this one. So yeah, so that's his job is partially to provide service, because this is Japan. Japan does service. They do it better than anyone. But he's also there to encourage service to come into his shop in a very, sort of pragmatic way. The more folks that come in, the better job he does, the more folks the more folks buy there, the more he's likely to get be able to make rent and get a salary. Okay. This is Shibuya, one of the most famous shopping streets in Japan, or shopping districts. Again, notice the totally eclectic nature of what's going on here. It looks incredibly chaotic. That's because about 70% of the companies here, again, are unique. I can guarantee this place is a owner place. Here's Forever 21. Well, that's corporate. These guys are corporate. I can't remember what they are. There's some sort of a corporate system. I think Game is corporate, but most of these other places here, that's all they've got. The company is under 5 people. It depends almost entirely on foot traffic. Like their Chinese counterparts who do a lot of their sales online. Japanese still don't do that. So they're desperate for bodies. They need foot traffic. Foot traffic equals potential revenue equals stay in business till next week. What's happened, especially in smaller Japanese towns and even in larger urban areas, is these shopping districts have become empty. I remember about must be almost 10 years ago. Yeah, right. When the sort of the middle end of the second falling apart. We were in Osaka going through one of the shopping streets like that, Nagoya one. In fact, let me switch that back. Because Shibuya is such a tourist attraction that it sort of has other things that make it work. But if this was, I think this is a couple of years earlier, if this was 2016, even in this busy shopping street, even in what looks like, say, afternoon, something like that, what you would find is maybe a quarter to a half of these stalls are shuttered. They just went out of business. They failed. More and more when you go to these shopping streets, which are traditionally how Japanese did retail. You walk down the street, it's fun. There's no really American equivalent to it. And every Japanese city has a bunch of these. Motomachi, I think, is the big one in Kobe, which is just about, I'd say 70% of that is closed now. And it just makes things really surreal because you look around and you wonder, well, is it a holiday? What the hell's going on? And you suddenly realize, no, these are empty spaces because no one's making any money. There's no business here. So you had to give up. These guys don't operate on any margin. I would be willing to bet that 1 month of bad sales and they're out of business. That's the reality of the Japanese corporate environment. It's absolutely stunningly brutal. Chinese corporate environment can be just as brutal, but it's brutal in different ways. And I think Chinese have much more flexibility in terms of, okay, well, this job, this career tanked, so I'm going to try doing that instead. Japanese, just because they're so fixated on this idea of gambate, that effort, I don't think they really have. Yeah, I don't think they really have the same. I don't know if I want to call it mental flexibility, but they just have a really hard time dealing with change. They don't handle change very well. And this is almost, I would argue, this is sort of universal for looking at Japan. Japanese don't do change. If they predicted where things are going to go, then they're real good at it. And that's how Japan became so successful in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the minute the changes started going directions they hadn't predicted, then all of a sudden, all bets are off. Again, as I mentioned before, very limited health and social benefits in Japan. There's no retirement options. You can't, pension plans are basically one-time payouts of a very small amount of money. And that's because the companies, in many ways, you could argue the companies run Japan. And so what happens is if you look at the American system, a large part of the American budget, a big chunk of it goes to various, social programs, Social Security, all sorts of stuff like that, public education. In Japan, very little of it does. So Japan has always operated off of a much smaller proportion of the tax base going to support folks, whether they're retired or whether they end up out of work and, need unemployment. And Japan is sort of like, so sad, too bad. And so the Japanese government has never had to provide that, which means that they then can spend the money on stuff that they want to spend it on rather than providing support services for folks. Yeah, and Social Security would be the classic. On one hand, you have universal health, but it's pretty minimal. And then there's really no social, to all intents and purposes, no Social Security system. And of course, and most importantly, is you can't change jobs. I was sort of shocked now that I'm in Nevada that some of the folks that work at the grocery store, the Smiths that I go to, just came up in conversation with the folks in front of me. They've been there for 20 to 30 years, as grocery store clerks at a grocery store. I find that sort of mind blowing for a bunch of reasons, but it's very unusual. If you look at Walmart, the one in Carson City, just down the street from me, there's a lot of job migration. People will be at Walmart and they'll go somewhere else, maybe to Costco, who knows what. In fact, the folks that I'm working with at the various museums, maybe 3 out of 8 have quit in the last year, and they've all got other jobs. In Japan, if you were dumb enough I can't imagine anyone would quit the market if you're let go, and that's it. You're terminated. You might be 32 years old with nothing. Now you're going to get some real chump change job, maybe being one of the guys working in one of those, ramen stands in Fukuoka, but you're never going to make any money. You're never going to get ahead. You're never going to be able to buy a house. You're going to have a hard time even making minimal rent. And if you get too old to work, and you have to remember, Japanese have the longest lifespan in the world. I think guys in Japan live to be 79 to 81 on average. In other words, 50 percentile. As a member of Japanese women, I'm sure I'm wrong. You have to check the demographics. I believe it's mid-late 80s. So I'm going to say just arbitrarily 86. So if I'm a Japanese woman, I'm going to be 86 years old. Japanese are let go in the workplace at the age 57. Even in the government, you're retired arbitrarily. 1 out of maybe 100 folks gets to keep on, and that's because they've got an OEM and Koban network that keeps them up. But everyone else is let go at 57. That means if I'm a Japanese guy, I have another 20, 30 years of my life, and I'm a Japanese woman, 30 to 40 years of life with no job. Basically, to all intents and purposes, no pension plan, no social security. And this is why when you go to Japan, you find that in any place, especially little restaurants or any place like that, especially the konbinis, you'll find the folks in the konbinis will oftentimes be like, look like they're 150 years old. Well, that's because if you don't have that job, how are you gonna eat? So the Japanese business world is a very brutal world, and the Japanese government has benefited because over the years it's meant that they don't have to put any money into, social service or social protection. That's always been, quote, the corporation's problem, and the corporations have always been good at really avoiding it. Now the corporations are cutting staff. No one knows what to do. That's the reality of the Japanese business world. That's the reality of Japanese society in 2026 is a bunch of folks that have no idea where they're going, what's coming, or how they're going to handle it.